So moving now in the order that was agreed, we begin by welcoming comments from Representative Evans.
There's a lot of people who have tried to figure out how to address this particular problem. As I was listening earlier to some of the researchers, who I believe certainly know far more than I do about this particular subject, that this subject in itself will not magically be addressed solely by the political process. This transcends the political process. It requires, in my view, faith-based organization. It requires education. It requires the business community. It requires labor to address this question of violence. And we only have to look at the statistics of what has occurred in the case of Philadelphia in the last 4 to 5 years. In 2004, homicides was 330. In 2005, homicides was 380. Last year, it was 406. In addition to that, you just read an inquiry in 2001 that the number of shooting victims was in the ballpark of 1,500. And it's gone from 31% to over 2,000 shooting victims. We know a lot more today than we knew 3 or 4 years ago. First, we know that if you're an African-American male, between 18 to 40, you're more susceptible to be shot and killed. Secondly, we know on Saturdays and Sundays that generally more activity happens than any other particular time. And we know in North Central Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, and Southwest Philadelphia, where communities are more affluent and where communities are predominantly white or Asian or any other race besides African American, we generally know that there's less opportunity that something can occur to you. So the real fundamental question is, what types of strategies should we put together to attempt to attack that problem? Now, I'm going to borrow a few things that were said by some of the people on the panel before me, and I'm going to start out with something that Dr. Rich said from Drexel University and who used to be in Boston. And I believe as a public official, we have generally thought that we could only handle this problem from a criminal justice standpoint. But Dr. Rich pointed out the aspect of public health. Very similar to the issue of the smoking issue in 1964, when the Surgeon General report came out, recognizing that we get people to unlearn that type of behavior. Well, I believe with what Dr. Rich has expressed, that one aspect of this that is extremely important is that this is a learned behavior, and that we need to figure out how we reverse that behavior. And the medical terms that people like Dr. Richardson use is primary, secondary, and tertiary. And that I don't believe that budgets have been organized in the element of focusing on the primary. That generally what we do is we operate from the back end. We generally have increased the amount of sentencing. We generally have tried to make sure that people in jail, for example, when I started in the legislature, we had 8,000 people in prison. Today we have 44,000 people in prison. We spend $1.5 billion in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in prisons. The city of Philadelphia spends over almost, in this proposed budget, the governor's talking about over $200 million. And then we know that things are extremely crowded in those prisons. So obviously, the laws that we have currently passed have not worked. So the first thing when you approach a particular problem is you got to recognize the severity of the problem. And I think, unfortunately, now we have reached a tipping point. I heard earlier, I think it was Mr. Carr who mentioned Fahim Thomas Childs in 2004, who was shot and killed, who was going to school in 90 rounds. 90 rounds. He was in the right place, not the wrong place, and he got shot and killed. Now, I want you to understand that when you think about that particular situation, and it was 12,000 people who marched on that street at that particular time, that Mr. Carr is correct. There was no way to direct that energy. Well, one of the things that I've worked on very clearly is something called a blueprint for a safer Philadelphia. And that is a 10-year initiative. Unfortunately, in politics, we generally don't view it in 10-year initiatives. We view it in election to election, and we tend not to view this in a long-term response. And we don't view it that way because primarily in campaigns, it's in 30-second sound bites. But this problem is deep-seated. And in order to reverse this problem, we got to begin to build things in place. And what are some of the kinds of things we got to begin to put in place? The things that I've talked about is like a four-legged stool. And one of the first parts of it is a quality education. Because a quality education is extremely important in my view of reversing that type of behavior. Secondly, moving people out of poverty and growing the middle class. The second aspect that I've talked about in terms of that four-legged stool is the element of a well-managed, visible police force. Not a police force that is abusive, not a police force that's taking advantage, but a police force that is used very effectively in terms of crime reduction. Not so much just by the question of the numbers that you raise, because the police department by itself won't be able to solve it. You know, unfortunately, when we see most shootings occur, you don't see the police commissioner with the health commissioner. You generally see the police commissioner. You don't see the health commissioner a part of that strategy. So obviously, the aspect of quality education, the aspect of a police force. The other aspect is the criminal justice system. A criminal justice system, which in my view has a great deal to do with it, but somewhat is driving this process out of tilt. Because basically, judges, you don't necessarily have them in coordination in terms of what is taking place in reduction of crime. And the last aspect that I think a great deal about, Bill Cosby was doing it the other day at Mount A Church of God in Christ. He was talking about individual and personal responsibility. Now, I know a lot of times we don't like to talk about personal individual responsibility, but we should start talking about personal individual responsibility. I was at McGee Rehabilitation Center a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to two young men, 118 and 125. And I was asking them, did they know the difference between right and wrong? Both of them knew the difference between right and wrong. And I was trying to really understand exactly how did they get into the particular position that they got in. And they basically said, look, you know, I knew what I was doing was wrong, but there was some reason that they was attracted to the negative behavior. Now, I understand there's a need to address poverty. I understand there's a need to address racism. I understand there's a need to address sexism, but you cannot forget the fact of talking about personal responsibility. And a lot of times, I don't think we talk about that. Yes, we got to create more jobs. Yes, we got to make our school system work. Yes, we got to address with the unfairness of the system. But some of these things we got to talk about similar to the way Bill Cosby is having this kind of upfront conversation. I heard Dr. Rich talk about the element of race. And we should have those kind of conversations. Because he's correct. What Lawrence Sherman said the other day is that if you tend to be white, this is not a fear factor in your particular case. If you tend to be in certain particular communities, it is more of a problem. So there is an unfair activity that is occurring in the city of Philadelphia. And what exactly do I think the mayor can do? First thing, I think the mayor can do all the governmental things I talked about in terms of police policy, education policy, put things on the front end. But I think the mayor also can use the bully pulpit. Use the bully pulpit in a way like it's never been used before in terms of focusing on certain kinds of behavior. You know, Juan Williams said it in his book called Enough. He talked about teenage pregnancy. He talked about those aspects. Well, we need to have conversations about that. We need to face up to some of those problems that are occurring today in our city and our society. We got to begin to address those things versus problems. So let me just close with this. I talked about it in a four-plank aspect. I talked about the aspect of quality education in the school system that is working for all. Talked about the aspect of what a well-functioning police department could work. Talked about the aspect of a criminal justice system that's not just a revolving door and that functions for everybody. And then I talked about the aspect of personal responsibility. I think all of those aspects together is ultimately where we can build the task. Look, if they could do it in New York, 8 million people, homicide rate 500 to 600 people, 8 million people. What they did is they had a sustainable period of time. 3 different mayors, Dave Dinkins, Giuliani, and Bloomberg. They all used different strategies over a long period of time, but they made a commitment that they were going to make New York the safest big city in America. Well, that's what I think has been lacking in Philadelphia, making Philadelphia the safest big city in America. Thank you.
Thank you.